All right. So again, this is compassionate resilience, a mandala of Kanon practices applied to chaplaincy training. So in the spirit of training, a well-known scholar of pedagogy and education, also a Buddhist, Bell Hooks, states our work is not merely to share information, but to share in the intellectual and spiritual growth of our students. To teach in a manner that respects and cares for the souls of our students is essential if we are to provide the necessary conditions where learning can most deeply and intimately begin. So, what could be a compassion pedagogy or a Kanon pedagogy? Pedagogy being the process or the style, the study of even teaching processes, instruction or training processes, and Kanon, the Buddhist embodiment of compassion. So for this presentation on essentially Buddhist contributions to chaplaincy or care training, and there are the field of chaplaincy, as many people might know, but just in case, that more so started the West and with more Christian culture and tradition as a base, but has spread out to become more interfaith oriented, and professional chaplains, no matter what their background, are supposed to care for people of any spiritual background, any religious background, or those with no religious background at all, meeting people with a specific care for their own needs. So despite this more interfaithization, a lot of the resources still are much more historically Christian based. And so this presentation is looking at one way of expanding some of the Buddhist tools that are possible within chaplaincy training. So this is a more pedagogically focused presentation in that sense, looking at potential training tools. And I'll especially be focusing on just the basis of a dual layered framework that's potentially applied to such chaplaincy or care-driven training programs or processes. Especially the tools that can be within them. Now, I'll talk a little bit about that framework in the next slide, but just briefly want to say the applications could be to many different things. It's not that a program, a training program, or a Master of Divinity program, or a CPE, the sort of chaplaincy internship training programs, or maybe even nurse training programs, things like that. It's not that it would have to be a one-on-one application, but these are just a framework of tools that one could take different parts of it, whatever applied to their program. So these, skipping one slide, looks like. For whatever reason, there's a trouble with this one kind of slide, but there's the framework. So just these two interlapping processes. So the first process that we'll go over briefly is just on increasing skillfulness or depth with specific forms of compassion, and then increasing the capacity to hold different forms of compassion and complementary capacities. So this first section, increasing the skillfulness and depth with specific forms of compassion. So in starting to train a particular type of compassion, we can start with, let's say, it's a chaplain or a nurse training program. Imagining just for a second one form of compassion and getting deep into that. This would first involve reflection questions, deeply thinking about compassion, how that interacts personally, and then leading from that into some meditation practices to more get that in depth into one's heart and mind. What are those reflections, but how do we really internalize those? And then taking that into a series of role-playing practices. And even these role-playing practices can develop in a series. For example, one can start simply in just pairs. If it's a classroom environment, for example, getting everybody into pairs of two and practicing a role-playing experience. For example, you say one person is the patient, one is the chaplain or the nurse, and run a brief simulation. Then you can expand that out with some practice to three-person groups where you also have an observer and rotate from the one person being the care provider, one being the care recipient, and one person being the observer who provides feedback. And then going into more role-playing in front of an entire group. So you get feedback from broader parts of the course and broader feedback along with it. But this way, there's a successive development as far as thinking about internalizing and then growing in comfort gradually in your role play, the style of role-playing practices, getting practice really incorporating these mental states before you ultimately put this into real practice in a real situation. So in this way, there's a gradated step in the training. So again, this is one form of the gradations we'll talk about, but now we'll talk a little about those actual increasing of the capacities to hold different types of compassion and maybe complementary capacities. So just a little bit of background to say what this means. Many people think of maybe compassion as only one type. It's just compassion. But even psychologically, psychologists and scientists, neuroscientists have gradually formulated and deciphered the impacts of different styles of compassion. And for example, some of my previous writings and research talk about as well how different types of compassion can even be more mentally healthy, sustainable for one's practice and work than other forms of compassion as well. So it's good to think about what varieties there might be. And in Buddhist traditions for long centuries and centuries of history, they have also talked about different types of compassion. So in a sense, we're taking and applying some of the tools from these traditions within Buddhism and asking how that might work within care practices. A couple categories of that I'll just be briefly looking at today are the sublime abodes or Brahma Viharas, Taizo halls within this particular mandala, and this particular mandala is also essentially fully themed on compassion, but there are many different Kanon images within it. So what might those different images imply as well? And I also just want to emphasize that within these practices, I mentioned the word complementary capacities, because they are presented as full systems in a way. So just focusing on compassion itself might not be sufficient to really being able to carry out that compassion realistically. That compassion is meant to be combined with other capacities as well. And so I want to make sure I include some elements of that too. So briefly, I think this is a little more, at least relatively a little more well-known among many Buddhists than some of the other elements. But I'll first talk about some of these so-called sublime abodes or Brahma Viharas. This is a set that is pretty common in many forms of Buddhism, from different types of Theravada, Mahayana, and Vajrayana. But it always includes essentially these four: loving kindness, compassion, joy or sympathetic joy, and equanimity. And they can come in different styles or manifestations and how they're organized, but this is just one of those. So the practitioner would try to, as much as possible, always feel a loving kindness or a pure goodwill. Along with that, this last one, equanimity. So a kind of calming, essentially, in the ideal sense, no matter what is happening around you, you're able to maintain that sense of calm. But then depending on the person's reactions or attitude in front of you, you either have compassion if they are suffering. If they are in a negative state of mind, you have this compassion, in this case defined as the mind taking its vision of freedom from affliction as its object. In other words, you have the hope that somebody's suffering will decrease or disappear. So if they are suffering, you have that compassion. If they are joyful, you share in that joy. You're not jealous of that joy, you share in it. So you might switch back and forth between these states from moment to moment even, depending on how the person is in front of you. So you're typically carrying this goodwill, loving kindness, equanimity, along with compassion or joy as needed. Again, this is just one system for now of this set of four, but in the interest of time, I'll just be introducing small portions of each of these. And so next, I want to go into this mandala, and each parts of these mandalas also can, even though the mandala as a whole represents compassion and the development of the purity of compassion, again, it's meant to be a whole system with different mental states all being complementary to different types of compassion as well. And so each of these sets or halls, as they're called, within the mandala can be a different kind of mental states that it represents. So in this case, I'm taking from the theme of those halls and adding reflections based on this that would be applicable to those in care training programs. So one of these halls, this first one, the Henchi Hall, which is basically the mother of all Buddhas. So there's a general theme in this particular hall of the origin of awakenings. So some reflections that might come from this process or this category are, what is my most ideal self? What conditions help inspire or lead to my best states of mind? What habits might I start which help me better achieve such states? What habits might I stop which help me achieve such ideal states of mind? And again, so this would just be the first part of the process, doing these reflections, then doing meditations to further deepen them, and then applying them in role-playing practices. And so this next part is the Fudo or Achala Hall, down a little further on the mandala. Some themes from this are the eliminating or reducing of the three poisons, which are, generally speaking, craving, aversion, and ignorance. And some reflections that might develop from this are, what unhealthy desires or attachments prevent or distract from my presence with another suffering in front of me? What unhealthy frustrations, angers, fears, or anxieties prevent or distract from my presence with another suffering in front of me? Or in what areas might I increase my awareness of my clientele to better serve them? And so again, these are, you might not originally think of this as compassion, but this is a very also necessary kind of state to consider, to combine with compassion to make the compassion more effective in a way. So another example is the Jizo Hall over on the left, or Kshitigarbha, this long green hall. And so a theme from that would be the mind states of facing and being with deep suffering. So some reflections from that might be, what varieties of another's suffering am I able to sit with and be almost fully present with? Are there some types of suffering I witness that are too difficult to handle? If so, why? What can I do to better prepare myself to be with suffering? And so in the interest of time, I'm just introducing a few parts of this potential mandala of practices. But within this bigger hall on the left, there's 3 rows of 7 going down. That's considered the Kanon hall itself, which has numerous types of Kanon. And so I'll just introduce 4 possibilities with those as well. So one form of Kanon to focus on is the Byakue Kanon. A theme with Byakue Kanon is the purity of the compassion. So some reflections from this can be, to what degree is my compassion truly directed at others' needs? Upon honest, deeper reflection, at what times might my compassion also include selfish points? Or at what times might my focus shift to my own experiences with suffering rather than the person in front of me? In what ways can I better purify my heart and mind in preparation to face another and their suffering? So different focuses and reflections about trying to purify the compassion that we have. Another kanon is Senju kanon, a theme from this being compassion adapted to others' needs. The keyword here being adapted. So Senju kanon, the image you might see, 1,000 arms, 1,000 hands. So there's a different hand, a different tool for each different person's needs. So some reflections from this could be, are my compassionate responses a one-size-fits-all, or do they change in the situation? If so, to what degree? How can I better adapt to others' needs as they shift through time, even from moment to moment? How can I better adapt my compassionate responses to different people? A third, a third kanon, which actually looks much different from these others, right? Is Bato kanon, who looks much more fierce in a sense. So a theme from this is the more strident and defilement crushing compassion. So in a way, this is a representation of the more tough love type of compassion that's somewhat necessary. In thinking about a mother and a child, it's more like they do not stick that fork in the electrical outlet. Even if you're yelling at the child, there's still a love and a compassion there, but it's a different type of compassion, right? So some reflections in the care sense can be, what times might I need to carry a tough love with the person in front of me? When I need to be more strict or stern, can I still maintain my compassion internally? In which such cases might I handle easier? In which such cases might I need more inner work? So again, just some sample reflections related to this kanon applied to care training. A final one, just as an example here, would be Nyo-irin kanon. A theme of hers being wish fulfilling or compassion to all forms of beings. And so this one is some reflections being, to what degree can I consistently maintain my hope for another's suffering to diminish? Does my compassion increase or decrease depending on the person or their responses? In my self-care, is my self-care sufficient enough to maintain my hopeful compassion over long stretches of time? So, and again, it doesn't show that last slide, but coming back here real quick. Coming back to our problem slide that doesn't show up in the other slideshow. So again, just a brief review coming back to this framework, that there's these two interacting processes. So I talked about all these examples of these different types of compassion, different ways to think about compassion in this second point. But with each of these, we can have these different levels of development as well, running from these reflection questions, internalizing those through meditation practices, and then getting more pragmatic and applying those to situations through a variety of role-playing steps as well. So in this way, these are, again, just some possible tools to apply to frameworks of chaplaincy training, whether it be in maybe courses of MDiv chaplaincy programs, nursing programs, CPE training modules, or some other frameworks as well. But just tools that are available from these Buddhist traditions, which can be worked and applied to these different chaplaincy pedagogies as well. So thank you very much. And if there's any questions or moving on.
Thank you very much. The organizer, I have to apologize for what I think. Noisy, but you can take a question after.
Okay.
Today's second presenter is Dr. Kanae Kawamoto.
はい。聞こえてなかったね。
あ、スタートから。すい
あ、じゃあ、
ません。この5分ぐらい。
もう一回言った方がいいですか？オンラインに聞こえてなかったってことですか？
ちょっとすみません。聞こえなかった。
OK です。
少し簡単にまとまって。
OK. I'm sorry, I muted. だってオフにしてって言ってたよ。Okay. Sorry, let me summarize in brief. Today's topic was spiritual care by religious professionals has always been a major issue in the modern world. Japanese Buddhist clergy struggle with how to provide it to society. So my research focuses on the activities of Zen Buddhist priest Itetsu Nemoto as an interest case study of the contemporary form of suicide prevention. So, in exploring the examination on the contemporary issues, Buddhism and suicide in Japan, the approach can be categorized into three main areas. The first is social and political trends, encompasses governmental approaches to cyber suicide problems. And number two is spiritual care in the public sphere, which refers to how spiritual care has been figured in the Japanese society. The care must cover the deficit in the number one to support provided by the government and the non-religious or non-profit organizations. And number three, Buddhist response involves how Buddhist professionals and institutions have addressed the suicide problems. In this presentation, I will focus on the Rinzai Zen priest Itetsu Nemoto, who is included in the third approach, number three. This will be an ethnographic study of his suicide prevention program. So why I focus on Itetsu Nemoto? As I will illustrate with the timeline later, the developments in these three areas have influenced services related to suicide prevention. Well, while the efforts of these areas effectively led to a decline in suicide rates, the numbers increased again after the pandemic, highlighting the unsolved challenges. So through an analysis of Nemoto's personal suicide prevention program, I aim to elucidate other potential supports that Buddhist clergy can offer, which are distinct from those provided by governmental initiative and standardized spiritual care services. Additionally, I aim to prompt Buddhist priests who are engaged in pastoral care to reflect on the significance of their activities and consider how they can better engage with relevance in the public sphere as various professionals. The other method. This presentation analyzes Nemoto's suicide prevention program based on my observation and interviews with him. For this, I have visited Nemoto's temple a total of 10 times since 2018, and including participating in the death workshop, the death project organized by him 3 times. Moreover, I conducted a series of online interviews with him, and particularly during the pandemic period from 2021 to 2023. I will also introduce some of his accounts, which I transcribed for an upcoming book publication this year. The timetable can be divided into 4 categories. The pre-basic act on suicide prevention, and the second time period is post-basic act on suicide prevention, and the third category is post-earthquake, and the number 4 is pandemic. And the left line is social events, and the middle is spiritual care approaches, and the number 3 is Nemoto's life events. So during the first category, basic law on suicide prevention. So during the 1980s, amidst rapid economic growth issues such as loan sharks and overwork deaths, which were economic hardships contributing to suicide, emerged. Accordingly, the relief organization addressing these issues were established. So in response to the increasing attention to mental health, the first hospice was opened in Japan here, 1980. But in 1985, Masashi Tamiya proposed a Buddhist term vihara for Buddhist hospice institution, distinguished them from regular hospices. And from 1991 to 1993, Japan experienced a 3-year period of the collapse of the economic bubble. And also in the same year, the complete manual of suicide was published. While it sold 1 million copies, it sparked controversy. Some prefectures restricted its sale to people under the age of 18 due to its association with an increase in suicides. But in 3 years later, after Eiichi Shinohara started free counseling for suicide, and he is one of the first Buddhist priests to openly engage in such counseling. And also, first Vihara facility was opened at Nagaoka Nishi Hospital in Osaka. And next year, in 1996, Nemoto experienced a serious motorcycle accident. And in 1998, the number of suicides exceeded 30,000 and remained constantly over 30,000 for the next 16 years until 2011. And the same year, the WHO proposed a definition of health, including the words spiritual and dynamic. The same year, Nemoto embarked on the Zen training. But in 2000, Yasuyuki Shimizu, a former public broadcast director, featured suicide orphans in a TV program. Since then, he has lobbied the Ministry of Health, Labor, and Welfare on the issue of suicide, and as a result, the ministry established the Committee on Suicide Prevention Measures in 2002. And in 2004, Smith founded the NPO Lifelink for suicide prevention. And the same year, Nemoto concluded his monastic training and started suicide counseling via social network services. The second time category is first basic act on suicide prevention. So in 2006, finally the basic law on suicide prevention was enacted. In the same year, Nemoto was appointed abbot at the Daizenshi Temple and began in-person suicide counseling in addition to his online efforts. In 2008, Japan gained notoriety as a suicide nation and drawing attention to its high suicide rate internationally. And with the enactment of the basic law and the wide recognition of suicide as a social problem in Japanese society, several Buddhist organizations began to respond here. So between 2009 and 2011, the networks of Buddhist priests focused on suicide prevention emerged across Japan, including initiatives led by Shinohara's NPO and groups in Kyoto and in Western Japan and Central Japan, directed by Nemoto. The third time category is first earthquake. So in 2011, the Great East Japan earthquake occurred, and prompting various support programs by religious professionals in affected areas and educational initiatives led by religious leaders. This led to the establishment of the interfaith chaplain system in 2016. On the other hand, in 2011 here, finally, suicide prevention measures became effective, and for the first time in the 16 years, the number of suicides became below 30,000. And around this time, Nemoto's suicide program gained attention both domestically and internationally, with interviews and articles published in prominent publications like the New Yorker and an American Buddhist magazine, Tricycle. And additionally, 2 documentary films were produced by foreign directors in 2017. And the fourth category, during the COVID-19 pandemic. So during the COVID-19 pandemic lasting 2 years, the number of suicides remained the same. Mostly, the majority was middle-aged males, but an exceptional phenomenon occurred during this period, an increasing in the number of suicides among young women from 10 to 20 years old. However, there was I should have. So this is a kind of overview of events related to suicide issue in Japanese society and Buddhist countermeasures and their current situation. So I referred to many publications from the sociologists and scholars, and there I summarized 3 common perceptions of suicide by both society, government, and spiritual caregivers. First, suicide should be recognized as a societal problem, not a personal problem. So the director of the NPO Lifelink, Shimizu, said, in contemporary Japanese society, suicide is a symbolic death of the present time and a societal structural problem that cannot be overlooked as a personal issue. In basic law suicide prevention also, in the article 2.2, it states, suicide prevention shall be conducted at the social level, taking account of social factors behind it. And also Shinohara, one of the first Buddhist priest who started with suicide counseling, she said, if suicide is an individual problem of being a weak person, have people suddenly become weaker in the last 30 years? So, and the second point is suicide have combined factors. Suicide often results from a combination of factors highlighting its complex nature. Shimizu and Saito, the author of Forced Death, says both of them said, we pointed out the proportionality with an unemployment rate first time. However, we found out as a result of the white paper on suicide. On average, 4 factors overlap behind each individual suicide. And Seiko further says, we analyze each factor, for example, overwork, unemployment, multiple debts, bullying. The causes of this discernible on suicide notes are only an expedient classification and do not provide the total picture of the problem. And also in an article 2 in the basic law on suicide prevention states, suicide prevention measures shall be based on the fact that suicide has diverse and complex causes and backgrounds. And also Shinohara, the priest said, expresses the multiple suffering from social structure. He said, if economic deterioration were only the cause, there would be more developing countries with higher suicide rates than Japan. Okay, and the number 3, the third characteristic, a common perception is suicide is a cornered death. Suicide is viewed as a result of feeling trapped with no other options. So the Committee of Suicide Prevention Measures writes, through the analysis of the psychology of those who have killed themselves, it is found out that they did not choose death voluntarily, but were driven into a corner at a standstill and felt no other solution but suicide. Suicide is a death pushed into, rather than an act of free will. Shinohara also similarly said, suicide is a death that is forced to choose in isolation, disconnected from the surroundings, rather than the death of free will. So then what countermeasures are needed from both the government and the spiritual care professionals? Shimizu says that the coordinated support across various sectors, balancing mental support and combating isolation is crucial. For example, psychiatry laws, governmental policy, and so on. And Shinohara also says we need to relate to each other more and free ourselves from isolation. So spiritual enrichment is related with the support of dealing with loneliness. So Buddhist clergy can offer unique spiritual care, emphasizing empathic relationships and growth for both caregivers and individuals seeking support. So, and also after the Basic Act, most of suicide prevention organizations by Buddhist priests have provided the services such as hotline, text counseling, such as by emails and letters, and the meetings and memorial services for the bereaved families. But not many provide in-person counseling at their temples. So how can the Buddhist spiritual care be developed? Can it be distinct from other religious spiritual care? So then I'd like to introduce its name of the suicide program, which is very characteristic. So what distinct suicide prevention program does NEMOT provide, which is different from governmental support, and also it is basically it's basically similar to the concept and method of spiritual care. Sorry, before that, I need to. So he was born in 1972 and did not come from a Tepa family. But at the age of 24, he experienced a severe motorcycle accident, rendering him unconscious for 6 hours. This life-altering event shifted his focus. from a frivolous pursuit to contemplating the themes of life and death only. And 2 years later, he was ordained as a Buddhist priest. And there he entered a Zen training center, driven by a desire to seek true happiness and find an ultimate entity that could never be fulfilled in the worldly life. And in 2004, after 4.5 years of intense training, he began a reverse ordination training process by himself. So Nemoto embarked on counseling endeavors and motivated by deep desire to understand why individuals contemplate ending their lives. He says, no matter how much you worry, it will be meaningless unless you solve the problem. You should not die before you solve it. What should I do for saving them from dying? That and the feeling drove me to start counseling. And also he started working in society. I wanted to know the before-after effect of whether or not my 4-year practice of the hard Zen practice, the training that I would also, so I would also work in a practical setting. So I worked in a major chain hamburger store starting with a capital M. And then I wanted to ask the question, does Zen have any meaning in a foreign affiliated workplace that pursue the rationality? And then during his time at the hamburger store, Nemoto started to provide counseling to student staff and housewives struggling with their life problems. So he dedicated himself to listening and providing support. And Nemoto actively engaged with individuals' experiences and thoughts through online forums and offline meetings. He established a community called the People Who Want to Die on the social networking service called Mixi, providing continuous support to its members. The community members numbered 700 people at the most. He taxed himself the discipline of responding 50 to 100 times a day to the members' posts in the community or to the comments on his diary on Mixi. And Nemoto also organized events to help individuals to regain sense of purpose and share their struggles, including tours to famous suicide spots and workshops like the Departure, which simulated death experience on their own funerals. So characteristic of his suicide prevention practice. Let me outline some characteristics of his suicide prevention. First is most counseling initially called Nemoto's temple first, but they must attend his first counseling session in person at his temple. The time of the first consultation is unrestricted, and he keeps each individual stay until they feel positive and start laughing. So after the first visit, subsequent sessions are available via phone or emails, allowing for continued support. And Nemoto endeavors to foster a relationship with his counselees that resembles friendship, aiming to create a community where individuals can relate to one another as equals and share their struggles without hierarchical distinctions. He said, I wanted to expand the suicide prevention circle by destructive and avoidable entails a unidirectional from the caregivers to the takers, or if not, entails a dichotomy between counselors and counselees, or caregivers and caretakers. I wanted to expand the suicide prevention circle, but the structure unavoidably entails the dichotomy between counselors and counselees. So instead, I wanted to build a community where people could relate to one another on equals. I want to bring people together and want them to make friends and share their problems. Number 3 is Nemoto's unconventional approach avoids traditional listening techniques, instead focusing on authentic and honest interactions with his counselees. In listening training, when the client said, I'm sad, the trainee are taught to repeat, oh, you are sad. This dialogue, I feel like being mocked, he said. Of course, at first he listened to them at all until he understands the counselee's situation, but he wants to thoroughly worry with them about their problems together. So he emphasized empathic engagement with the feelings and opposed the formulated responses. And also, he organizes a death simulation workshop at departure. So, participants in this workshop are asked to write down their favorite people, activities, and aspirations on sticky notes. Nemoto participates there too. And then, acting a terminal ill patient, participants gradually throw away sticky notes one by one, symbolizing the renunciation of life. And ultimately, participants in pairs are asked to listen to their partner's testament, where they listen to each other's final wishes. Following this discussion, Nemoto chants the Heart Sutra at the simulated funeral ceremony. I will skip. This is this workshop. So now they are in pairs and listening to their partner's testament. And the simulated funeral chanting this workshop is. This is me. This is me. So there are critics. While Nemoto is praised for his involvement within Buddhist communities, there are also criticism against him. Some argue that he operates too personally and lacking organization in his efforts. And the critics suggest that if Nemoto truly aims to effectively combat suicide, he should collaborate more systematically and efficiently with legal professionals and government agencies and part of a cohesive group. So in response to this criticism, Nemoto states, I believe that government support in this country is well serviced. If you need some counseling or advice with someone, you have hotlines and healthcare centers and free legal advice. So if you want to solve problems legally, I have no doubt that there should be no other countries than Japan in the world. But there will be many suicides. So I think this country is dangerous when you consider that so many people are dying, even though there is no war, terrorists, or killing each other. But young people have no hope. So he points out, sorry. So as an outline in the section of common perception of suicide, Nemoto similarly criticized the assumption that directly links poverty along with the determinant of suicide, as it makes a plausible narrative for media to thrust the responsibility to society. But he argues that the true villain behind suicide is a perceived feeling of loneliness, closely linked to depression. He says, when suicide issues are reported, the media often focuses on motives such as unemployment and health. However, in my actual counseling practice setting, the problem of people who want to commit suicide are overwhelmingly caused by inner problems such as anxiety. I have seen many people who had perfect jobs, sufficient status, families, and homes around them, all of which it would be enviable to others. But the loneliness is what everyone is talking about when it comes to suicide. So what is Nemoto is aiming at goal? So Nemoto prioritized deep physical intervention to combat loneliness, echoing the method employed by H. Shinohara and spiritual care practitioners. But unlike many monks who limit their interaction to devotees, Nemoto offers long-term counseling and even accommodation at their temples if necessary. He said, I sought out individuals to explore potential connections and support system for those who have attempted suicide. I want to create I want to create the strongest group of amateurs who can do what health centers, hospitals, counseling centers, and other professional organizations can't. We want to create a relationship where people can confide in each other on equal footing from the same perspective and learn self-care skills, as well as express themselves through retreats such as Zen and other workshops. There are many specialized institutions, healthcare centers, hospitals, counselors. Anyone can go to those places. But instead of dealing with professionals, it is also possible to connect as equals at the same level and develop heart-to-heart relationships. So they can learn self-care. They can learn skills to restore themselves and support one another. So I also want others to imitate that my way of community building. Here, so, in conclusion, Demo to the suicide prevention approaches is deeply personal and may lack formal organizations or structure. However, there are valuable lessons that other Buddhist priests can learn from his community building efforts, which go beyond mere consultation methods. Furthermore, engaging in suicide prevention requires a priest to contemplate the meaning of life and death within the context of their own individual religious training and spiritual progress. Lastly, I still plan to continue interviewing two other priests for an ethnographic study and will complete the forthcoming book on Nemoto's work. I'd like to welcome any feedback on the future research. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now we are going to move on to third and last presenter, Scherer. Buddhist chaplaincy perspectives from the Netherlands.
Thank you very much. Okay. Can you hear me okay? Yeah. Everybody online also can hear me? Yeah. Can
Very
I
clear.
Thumbs up? Well, I hope it's okay. Right. So, thank you so much for this opportunity to be part of this important conversation. And maybe better okay. Thank you so much for this opportunity to be part of this lovely conversation and to follow deep thinking and wonderful presentation is a great honor. I want to share some perspectives on Buddhist chaplaincy from the Netherlands. Last year, when I had the honor to be an Amata scholar here at Ryukoku, I was privileged to share some information about the legal structure of Buddhist spiritual care in the Netherlands, as well as giving some thoughts and insights into the activities and the educational setup of the Buddhist seminary at the Vrije University in Amsterdam. And you might remember me saying that the Netherlands is rather unique within Europe because it was established that certain groups in government care, particularly detainees in the prison service and soldiers in the army, have a constitutional right, in particular, for spiritual care, for what we call chaplaincy, according to their own religion and worldview. So this also makes the post-academic, the post-master Buddhist spiritual care training program that we conduct at the seminary unique in the whole of Europe. It's the only government recognized training program. So the Netherlands is the only European country with a government recognized and accredited civil service entrance training program for Buddhist chaplains. Before our students embark into the specific Buddhist integrative postmaster certification for the Dutch civil service, they first must complete academic courses in Buddhist studies and an MA, a Master in Spiritual Care, located at the Faculty of Religion and Theology. So it's a religious studies master. That includes work placements, intervision, and supervision. This is similar to the twofold approach of Buddhist content and clinical pastoral education, which we know from America as CPE, and which is operated as such in a couple of places throughout the United States, including the University of the West and Upaya Zen Center and I think Harvard Theological Union, Europa also. So there's a couple of very good places there. What we could say is that in total, there are slightly less CPE equivalent work placement hours required with us in the Netherlands, and it is structured in a twofold way. Additionally, there are segments of society where Buddhists work as chaplains or as general spiritual caregivers, usually having a required MA in spiritual care, but who are not certified Buddhist chaplains. And this is due to an anomaly in Dutch regulations, which does not compartmentalize spiritual care for hospitals, for hospices, and for private care sectors, and rather leaves the religious and worldview affiliations of chaplains to the institutions or the individuals. However, all chaplains in those situations are expected to cater to clients of all religions and none, which makes this type of general chaplaincy particularly interreligious, and a good understanding of and respect and empathy for all faiths and worldviews becomes imperative. While this demand for high interreligious literacy, you could say, interreligious literacy on Buddhist chaplains is slightly less pressing in the segmented Buddhist chaplaincy areas, which are basically the prison service and the army and also the psychiatric wards. It is still important in these fields, a necessary factor, that you have interfaith skills within these inherently multi-religious and pluralist settings. And here we come to some particularities of Buddhism within Dutch societies and the wider European context. The Dutch Buddhist chaplaincy training and practice differs considerably from the ones found in Japan due to the unique societal context, while arguably Japanese Buddhist chaplaincy is also operating in a hybrid or multi-religious environment. The ingrained history of Japanese Buddhist schools and their post-Meiji organization, which includes family temples and non-celibate priests, makes for a much clearer profile of Buddhist chaplaincy, both in terms of denomination, so you have Shin chaplaincy, Shingon chaplaincy, Zen chaplaincy, and in terms of clerical orientation. Clerical orientation, usually the ordained priests that are the chaplains, as I understood, and please correct me if it's wrong. In contrast, Dutch Buddhist chaplains are mainly non-clerics. Actually, I think I'm the first cleric heading the Buddhist seminary. So that's a complete anomaly. And their so-called Buddhist sending agency, the BZI, is an interdenominational entity derived from, yet also separate from, the Dutch Buddhist Union. And it is legally a necessity by law, this entity, that guarantees the faith affiliation of Buddhist chaplains. And again, the Netherlands is slightly unique in Europe because actually the Dutch Buddhist Union represents, you can say, 80% of Buddhists in the Netherlands. That contrasts to other countries in Europe where there is no really overarching organization in England, for instance. And the German Buddhist Union, for instance, can maybe claim to represent 50%, or the Italian Buddhist Union, they don't include Soka Gakkai, for instance, which make up almost 50% of Buddhists in Italy themselves. And so, you know, so but we represent 80% of the Buddhists in the Netherlands, and that includes the major ethnically oriented groups. So we have the big Thai temples, we have the big Chinese temples, and so on, included in the Buddhist Union. And although that is there, so the boards of both organizations are not comprised of authorized clerics or Dharma teachers or similar, but rather they are comprised of volunteers from various groups with very varying understanding of the Buddhist Dharma in terms of flavor and in terms of school affiliation, but also in terms of depth and quality. It's a demanding voluntary job, and basically anybody who volunteers gets the job. This makes for a challenging situation, since often Dutch Buddhist chaplains operate from a specific angle of Buddhist modernism that sees Buddhism as a singular. And this singular means then an individual and quasi-secular path towards well-being. Indeed, the early reception, as you all know, of Buddhism in European cultures within the parameters of European modernism imbued European Buddhism with lasting emphasis on rationalistic, scientific, positivist, and personal philosophical approaches that reductively, constructively, the now thickly globalizing Buddhist traditions as a practical philosophy and a counterweight to any perceived irrational, authoritarian, and hierarchical modes of religiosity. That means that we often deal with non-clerical, semi-secular, or what you could call culturally secular Dutch Buddhists who have no strong sense of a Buddhist communal or identitarian belonging, but who see Buddhism as a set of meditation or mind cultivation practices. So there's a lack of grounding in Buddhist teachings and a lack of grounding in communal traditions for many Buddhists, and also for a good number of Buddhists or Buddhism-aligned spiritual caregivers. Further, there is another phenomenon of so-called dual or multiple religious belonging. For instance, people can define, this is also known in America, you now have the Jews, for instance, although sometimes they say the Jewish people then say, well, the Jewish identity is more an ethnic identity and then Buddhist is more. So, but we have people in the Netherlands and in Europe who say, well, I'm both a Catholic and a Buddhist. Now, from Asian perspective, that is okay, obviously. Yeah, it's very normal to go to the Taoist temple, to the Shinto temple, but also to go to a Buddhist temple and so on. But maybe the distance between Catholicism and Buddhism is slightly wider. I don't know. I don't know. But this interesting thing, the multi-religious belonging, and that complicates what we could say an orthoprax Buddhist grounding. And the other thing that complicates Buddhist orthopraxy is the emergence of, in this young Buddhism in Europe, of what you could call eclectic new Buddhist movements, such as Triratna, yeah, like the Friends of the Western Buddhist Order formerly, or secularly assigned Neo-Zen and Neo-Post-Theravada groups, or even groups like Stephen Batchelor's Buddhism Without Beliefs and so on, you know. So what we find is a high degree of fragmentation, and if you want, there's also a high degree of confusion, if you want to be value judgmentally about it. Maybe this is to be expected at this early and young stage of acculturation of Buddhist traditions in the Netherlands and in Europe. Buddhism is indeed still in its kindergarten stage, and despite its infancy, must immediately negotiate complex, competitive, and contradictory Buddhist and non-Buddhist, yet Buddhist adjacent offers in the global spiritual supermarket. Within the religious late capitalist neoliberal modern and postmodern frameworks. So not an easy feat. To illustrate these more abstract points, I would like to present what I will call an anonymized composite case taken from Dutch Buddhist chaplaincy work. Within the context of segmented or pillarized, we say in Dutch society, services during the intake. So for instance, if you come into the army at the beginning, or you start your detention in prison, or you start your sojourn in a psychiatric ward, in a closed psychiatric ward. So during this initial stage, the prospect service users are asked to check the box of desired chaplaincy type. And the religious and worldview affiliation or none of the spiritual caregiver is determined in this way by an opt-in process, Making use of multiple chaplaincy services is not allowed. Hence, you either request a humanist or a Buddhist, a Hindu, a Muslim, or one of the Christian chaplains, but you cannot have more than. This also means that some service users may check the box Buddhists, and indeed they do so, even if they do not have a Buddhist subjectivity, belonging, or affiliation. You see how elegantly I always try to avoid the word identity. We should speak of subjectivities and belongings rather than identity. So instead, these clients choose Buddhism as their form of chaplaincy because they feel curious about Buddhism, maybe, associate Buddhism with positive mental effects, or think of Buddhist chaplains as gentle and less judgmental. Similar, where Buddhists work in general settings as chaplains, they also report that their service might be preferred by the general population due to this trust in their non-judgmentalism. Nota bene. So just a note, in the Netherlands, all chaplains are subject to official secrecy. So confessional secrecy, that would be in the Catholic Church. Yeah? Official secrecy, which means nothing the client discloses will be shared without permission of the client. So the following semi-fictionalized example with elements is drawn from different real cases in order to preserve the anonymity of the participants, and is based on several intervision, supervision, and reflective work data from our active Buddhist chaplains, and from the confidential files that we hold in the Buddhist seminary. Obviously, I cannot disclose the data and I cannot identify anybody, but so we are also bound by official secrecy. But I can present this semi-fictionalized composite case study. Our composite case sees a chaplain and a service user who confesses to disturbing thoughts and actions around the theme of sexual abuse. The client states that they are not a Buddhist and shows no interest in learning more about Buddhism. Instead, their secret thoughts are only known to very few in the environment of the client. It is known to a psychologist who helps them with their harmful fantasies. With the Buddhist chaplain, they mainly talk about aspects of actions, their struggles with harmful desires, and they disclose details to the Buddhist chaplain of their efforts to change their behavior and the likeness of acting out their desires again. The strategies employed by the Buddhist spiritual caregiver are limited to what I might want to call post-Buddhist caregiving techniques. What are these? These are, for instance, deep listening. So derived from a psychologist from a Tibetan Buddhist background, stopping and giving presence to the suffering. And a bit of MBSR, which you all know, mindfulness-based stress reduction. Attempts by the chaplain to include more Buddhist ethical discernment and inquiry, or Buddhist non-secular elements such as rituals, or meditations such as metta bhavana, or even elements of post-Buddhist mindfulness-based compassion training, again, something that has been developed by, in this case, more Neo-Theravada aligned Buddhists, Fritz Costa and these kind of people, are met with resistance. The client expresses that they are interested in the mental calming and well-being aspects of the chaplaincy service, basically talking, and that they value the non-judgmental open attention of the Buddhist chaplain for their disclosing, reflecting, and processing. In fact, the client indicates that they are disclosing more and more honestly to the Buddhist chaplain than to their psychologist, who might, because the psychologist might in a future time have a negative impact, or the psychologist has a different power status. Yeah, the psychologists, they might in the future have to write an assessment. So the Buddhist chaplain gets the full blow of the honest disturbances. Very little space is given to Buddhist content. So the Buddhist aspects lies mainly here, in this case, are in the habitus of the chaplain themselves, who is non-judgmentally sitting with suffering, but also with the mental disturbances of the client, or to put it in the words of the Patamamitha Sutra and the Anguttara Nikaya, Dudadam dadati, giving what is difficult to give, as a spiritual friend, as a kalyana mitta, or mitra in Sanskrit. For the client, the pastoral care is secular, non-Buddhist. The chaplains themselves remains, however, grounded in their own Buddhist framework, while loyally dukaramchapi kubati, doing what is difficult to do, giving presence to suffering with non-judging ear. So atopisa duratami kamati dukamanacha, enduring hard words and things hard to endure, and facing their own secret darkness, keeping secret, the dark and deeply disturbing thoughts and information witnessed, not forsaking, nor disdaining the client. That is what the Buddhist practitioner does. The chaplain does. The Buddhist practice becomes, through this framework of the Kalyana Mitta, Buddhist self-care. The Buddhist care for the client is basically secular care, with the Buddhist chaplain exercising Buddhist self-care. So that's very interesting, isn't it? This is a particular clear in the chaplain's need for aftercare, which comes through in the intervision and in the supervisions. Yeah. And for employing any tool possible in the Buddhist toolbox to protect themselves from the images of harm and to maintain gentleness and compassionate listening. So I'm kind of linking to your point, Nathan, about equanimity, you know. The secular pastoral care given by a Buddhist to a service user with disturbing fantasies and past harmful actions takes effect at a glacial speed by slowly weakening denial, weakening deflection, shifting the moral compass, and providing breathing space for personal growth. Well, of course, Shin Buddhists would point to Shinran's famous dictum in the Tanisho about evildoers being Amida's first clients in liberation. Even a virtuous person can attain rebirth and pure land. I don't really need to translate that for you here. How much more easily a wicked person. The depth, and this is how I conclude here, the depth of human potential for evil is terribly present in the client's muddled cravings. Yet, like Amida embraces all human evil, the Buddhist chaplain tries their best to offer non-judging liberatory presence and space for whatever inner transformation can be effectuated. And with this, I want to end and thank you very much.